Thanks, Tony. It's really excellent to be here. I'm excited to get to talk to you today about some of this recent work. So as a philosopher, probably like everybody in here, there are three things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the world, I'm interested in what's going on subpersonally with us, and I'm interested in how things are consciously for us as subjects. And in particular, I'm interested in the relationships among these various things. So another way to put this is that I'm interested in perception. So now, this kind of investigation requires a reasonably accurate conception of each of these things, the world, the subpersonal, and the conscious. And one complication of my line of work is that there are really different tools that are appropriate for each of these subject matters. Another kind of complication for my line of work, and that motivates me, is that theorizing about perception in philosophy and in the cognitive sciences has been driven to a really remarkable extent by attention to vision and visual forms of awareness. So this is an actual photograph that I captured one day sitting at my desk, staring at the bookshelf above my desk on books about perceiving, and I sort of realized I had this perfect example of my entire research program facing me right there. So vision really has furnished the puzzles and provided the data and shaped how we understand perceiving. Now, this is pretty understandable, right? We care a lot about our vision, and most of us would be very, very sad to lose our vision. And to a huge extent, we are visual creatures. But that belies the extent to which we're also auditory, and tactual, and gustatory, and olfactory, and kinesthetic, and proprioceptive creatures as well. More importantly, I think for theorizing about what it is to be a perceiver, nothing guarantees that what we say about vision and seeing is going to extend neatly to the other modalities. Okay, so my work is all about discovering what there is to learn about perceiving by paying attention to non-visual modalities and to relationships and interactions among various sense modalities, from a more theoretical standpoint than a scientist, for example, would. So I've written about sounds and also about crossmodal and intermodal interactions in perception, and I'm working on a book on the senses. So what I want to talk about today is how some of this work applies to thinking about our encounters as audiences with works of art. So artworks, as you all realize, engage the senses of their audiences in various kinds of ways, right? My starting point today, though, is going to be what I think is a really intuitive distinction that we all walk around in the world with. And that's that some art forms predominantly engage one sense modality or the other. So, for example, painting and photography engage the visual sense, and music and sound art engage the auditory sense, and things like maybe perfume engage the olfactory sense. Now, on the other hand, some art forms engage more than one sense modality and by design. So, for example, movies engage vision and hearing, and so does dance. Fine food, for example, engages gustatory and tactual and visual and olfactory senses, and architecture engages multiple sense modalities as well. So now, what intrigues me as a philosopher with an interest in cognitive science is whether and how all of the art forms that I just mentioned actually turn out to engage multiple sense modalities in ways that maybe are more surreptitious than the ones that I've talked about or on this slide here. Okay, so, and even when that doesn't occur by design. So that's what I want to talk about today. So what I'm going to argue is that there are empirical and good philosophical and theoretical grounds for thinking that in fact they do, and that this suggests an entire category of aesthetically relevant features that can be explored and manipulated to artistic effect. So I want to start off with just one caveat and one apology. So the caveat is that my focus today is going to be on audiences. So talking about artists and performers, obviously, I think would advance what I have to say much further than in fact I do. So the focus will be on audiences. The apology is that I'm talking about the arts in general. Everything I say is about the arts in general, and even though music provides some really beautiful and I think some of the most compelling examples, it's not the exclusive domain of the issues that I'm talking about today. Okay, so let me start off, since I am a philosopher after all, with some terminological preliminaries. So I want to say that works of art have aesthetic properties, and that these are, they either are or that they're among the sources of aesthetic value. So I have in mind things like beauty, form, originality, contentfulness, and the like. Now, I want to say that a feature of an instance of a work of art is an aesthetically relevant feature just in case some of the aesthetic properties of artworks depend on it, okay? Now, these features I want to distinguish from the aesthetic properties themselves and say that they're the sorts of features that impact aesthetic properties, but they're not necessarily identical with them. So things like color, pitch, shape, rhythm, authorship, the date of origin of some piece, the intent behind a piece or its content, maybe whether it's an original or a forgery. These are features that impact aesthetic value but don't necessarily need to be aesthetic properties themselves. Okay, so now what I want to say is that a feature of an instance of a work of art is a sensorially perceptible, aesthetically relevant feature, just in case it's an aesthetically relevant feature, and it's perceptible by means of one of the externally directed sense modalities, like vision, or hearing, or touch, or smell, or something along those lines. Okay, now, the point of doing this is that not every aesthetically relevant feature is going to be sensorially perceptible. Okay, so some of the things on the list of aesthetically relevant features are, so things like color and pitch and shape and rhythm, and some aren't. So you can't just tell by sensing whether something is a forgery or when it was made. Okay, so these include features like this. Now, the last bit of technical terminology that I'm going to introduce is that the concept of a perceptual experience mattering aesthetically. So a perceptual experience of an instance of a work of art will matter aesthetically just in case it involves being perceptually aware of some aesthetically relevant feature that is sensorially perceptible. Okay, so that's enough of the terminological preliminaries. So, as I said earlier, I think it's natural to divide the art forms into two broad categories. Now, this isn't meant to be exhaustive. It's just meant to say that there are some that fit these different classes. So, intuitively, the unimodal arts are the arts of one sense, and intuitively, the multimodal arts are the arts of more than one sense. So, the unimodal arts include things like I said earlier, painting, photography, maybe music, sound art, and things that we classify as the visual arts. That would be a nice example of a unimodal art. So these are arts whose aesthetically relevant features are accessible to one sense modality. Now, if we want to make this a little bit more precise, we can actually distinguish stronger and weaker characterizations of what it means to be a unimodal art, or potentially be a unimodal art. So, according to a pretty strong view of what it is to be unimodal, there's a unique sense modality such that every perceptual experience that matters aesthetically is associated with that very modality. So, only experiences associated with, for example, vision are going to matter aesthetically or to reveal aesthetically relevant perceptible features of a work. So I've got a little schematic so that this doesn't get too out of hand. So these are supposed to represent aesthetically relevant features of a work of art. Okay, so things like color, pitch, timbre, shape, and the like. Now, if we introduce stand-ins for a couple of sense modalities, like this might be vision, and that might be audition, or you might have audition and touch. My wife told me that this was really confusing because it should just say vision and audition. But I don't want it to just be vision or audition. I want it to be any old sense modality, okay? So modulo my confusing notation, those just stand in for any sense modality. So a strongly unimodal artwork is one such that all of the perceptual experiences that matter are associated with it, and that other modality isn't providing any access to aesthetically relevant features. So you'll notice that this is a pretty strong view. So we might go for a weaker characterization of what it means to be unimodal. So according to this weaker version, we might say that there's one sense modality that suffices. It's enough to get at all of those aesthetically relevant features, okay? So the point of doing this is to say, so there's this single modality here, notice it's sufficing, but by talking about sufficing, we allow that other modalities provide access to that feature, but notice that having one of those senses is enough to get at all of the relevant features. This is providing kind of redundant awareness there. Okay, so you'll notice already that there's a kind of multimodality going on even in this weak form. Right? So there's more than one sense involved in this engagement with the artwork. So the multimodal arts that I mentioned before include intuitively things like film or opera or dance or architecture. And I said those are arts whose aesthetically relevant features are ones that are accessible to more than one sense modality. And so again, we can make a stronger or a weaker version of this claim. So according to the weak version, which I want to mention first, we've kind of already got a version of that. So this says that perceptual experiences that are associated with more than one sense modality reveal these aesthetically relevant features, and therefore they matter aesthetically. So the thing to note is that this weak conception of multimodality is actually compatible with the weak version of unimodality. It's not compatible with the strong version. So we can then talk about an even a stronger version of the multimodal claim and say that a work of art or an art form is strongly multimodal just in case one sense modality all by itself doesn't suffice to perceptually experience all of the sensorially perceptible aesthetically relevant features of the work. Okay, so in order to perceptually experience all of the aesthetically relevant features, you need at least two senses, okay, at least two modalities. So the thought here is that this modality is now providing not redundant access, but kind of novel access to some new feature of the work, all right? So this strong version of multimodality it characterizes multimodality in a way that's incompatible with either of the unimodal stories. Okay, so that's some of the background picture. And I want to step back from this background a little bit and ask two questions. Okay. So the first question focuses on these multimodal art forms. And it asks, in what way does perceptually experiencing the aesthetically relevant features of a multimodal artwork depend on perceptual experiences that are associated with more than one sense modality? And in particular, I'm interested in whether doing so depends on what we might call crossmodal perceptual experiences, or perceptual experiences that can't exhaustively be characterized in terms of distinct experiences that are associated with different modalities which might have occurred in isolation or in absence of each other or without each other. Okay, so the idea is, does appreciating the aesthetic properties of one of these works of multimodal art depend on having perceptual experiences that are more than the sum of their parts? So that's the first question. The second question is a simple question. Are there any unimodal art forms? And as a preview, I'm going to argue later on that there aren't. Okay, so focus now on the first question. So the idea is, to what extent and in what ways does being in a position to appreciate the aesthetic value of a work of multimodal artwork depend on multimodal awareness? So now what I want to do is talk about 6 different ways in which it does. Okay? So the first form is what I want to call minimal multimodality. So some perceptual experiences of artworks are minimally multimodal, right? So they're multimodal just in the sense that they involve experiences associated with more than one sense modality, right? So if, for example, you're watching a dance performance with some music, perceiving the performance requires seeing the movements of the performer, but it also to get everything that's going on aesthetically requires hearing some of the music and other features going on. So it requires having auditory experiences of the acoustical and other features. It requires having visual experiences of the visual features, like the movements and the shapes and patterns. So dance actually turns out to be a strongly multimodal art form. Notice, though, that the aesthetically relevant audible features, the features you can hear, are ones that you could have heard even if you hadn't been seeing, right? If you'd had your eyes covered, you could have heard the relevant music. And the aesthetically relevant visible features are also ones that you could have seen even if you hadn't been hearing, right? So if you'd had your ears plugged, you could have seen the visible features. So maybe it's the case that in watching a dance performance, the auditory and the visual experiences that you could have had independently from each other suffice. That is, that they're enough to reveal all of the aesthetically relevant perceptible features of that work, right? So here you've got the visual and the auditory, and those are enough to reveal the aesthetically relevant features. So jointly, these experiences exhaust your perceptual experience of the aesthetically relevant features of the work. Okay, so if that's the case, then what we've got here is we've got a multimodal experience when you're watching the dance performance and listening to it. But what's critical is why that experience matters can be captured completely by just mentioning the visual and the auditory, independent from each other. So whenever that's the case, call that perceptual experience minimally multimodal, right? It's multimodal in this minimal respect that it involves experiences that are associated with at least two sense modalities. Okay, so these things happen simultaneously, but they might have occurred separately. Okay, so the next question is, are there additional aesthetically relevant features of that dance performance beyond the ones that are revealed by the auditory experience and the visual experience? So for example, right, forgive my simplistic example. So you hear a high note and you see a leap, right? So you see a jump while hearing a high note. You might think that you're also aware of the concurrence of the note and the jump, right? So the conjunction of the note and the jump itself has aesthetic significance. So that combination of the audible and the visual has aesthetic relevance that's not explained by mentioning the individual presence of the audible and the visible features. Okay, so here we've got an experience, a perceptual experience of concurrence that's a cross-modal perceptual experience and that matters aesthetically, and it's not simply the co-occurrence of a visual experience and an auditory experience, which could have happened independently. So it's not just simply it's not just minimally multimodal. Now, there are a couple of objections to this kind of claim, right? The first objection is aesthetic math is really hard. So once we account for the aesthetic contribution of the visual feature and the auditory feature, and we sort of add them together, why think there's something else, right, beyond that that's gained by talking about awareness of the conjunction of those things? Now, this is an objection that I'm willing to live with, but I think there is another objection that's a little more pressing in this context. And that objection is that the conjunction all by itself isn't something that's a sensorially perceptible, aesthetically relevant feature. So somebody might say it's a feature that's grasped in sort of extra perceptual cognition. You can reflectively think about it and notice that conjunction, but it's not something that you're literally sensorially perceiving. Okay? So if that's right, then that experience doesn't matter in the relevant sense I'm talking about because it's not a perceptual experience. So what we've got is this case collapsing into the earlier case and turning out to just be minimally multimodal. Okay, so luckily for me, I guess, it turns out that there are a class of cases that demonstrate that these effects are genuinely perceptual at some times, okay? And the ones that I want to talk about involve cross-modal illusions. and recalibration. So these are cases in which stimulation to one sensory modality impacts and changes perceptual experience that's usually associated with another sense modality, and in a way that generates a perceptual illusion. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about for the next few minutes. So some of these effects are pretty familiar. I'm sure you've all heard of the ventriloquist effect. So the ventriloquist effect is an auditory illusion of the spatial location of a sound that's produced by the visible location of an apparent sound source. Now, the ventriloquist illusion is a genuine perceptual illusion. It actually doesn't require speech, and it's not something like, throwing a sound. It's actually a perceptual illusion. It's a pretty robust one. Some of these cases get a little more exotic. So the case of, sorry, this slide is a little bit of a mess. The case of visual capture of proprioceptive location, or this is a relative of the rubber hand illusion. So this is a case where if I show you a picture, so you're looking at a picture of your hand and your real hand is over there where you can't see it. In a lot of cases, you'll actually feel your hand to be in the location where you see that rubber hand to be. So it'll feel to you as if, and actually you can get a sense of feeling like it's tickling you as well on a rubber hand. Okay, so these are, so this is a really nice effect. Some of these effects actually involve movement. So there's this motion bounce illusion, which is a really nice example. So if you're just looking at these two disks on a screen traversing these trajectories, the majority of people will see those as continuing on streaming straight line paths past each other. If you add a little auditory blip, just a bloop, right when they hit that spot, most people, the majority, the numbers switch, and you start getting a bouncing percept. You see them to move in these bouncing trajectories. So that's audition impacting visual experience of motion. Another case, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. So just by show of hands, how many people have seen or heard of the McGurk effect? Oh, so enough that it's worth actually playing it. Okay, so this is a really nice effect. It involves a speech sound. And this is, so I'm going to play a little YouTube video that's pretty famous and that many of you, I'm sure, have seen a million times over. But what I want you to do, so everybody, the first thing I want you to do is close your eyes, and I want you to listen carefully to the speech sound that you hear. Okay, it's a nonsense sound, but it's a speech sound nonetheless. So listen to the speech sound.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, so what sound did you hear? Yeah, okay, so everybody heard the ba. Okay, so now I want you to look, I want you to watch this, and I want you to focus on the speaker's lips and listen to the speech sound that you hear.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, so what did you hear? Da, lovely chorus of da. So what goes on, and I just played the same audio and slide twice. I just backed up and played it again. So it's the same thing, same stimulus. What goes on is
ba,
that
ba,
there's...
Ba, ba,
Sorry, he's not supposed to...
ba, ba.
We've got the audio track of someone articulating the bilabial ba sound, and that's put on top of the video of this guy articulating the velar ga sound. And what most people get, not everybody, but most, get is this experience as of the alveolar da sound. Okay, so what you're getting here is a visual impact on auditory experience for these speech sounds. Okay, so that's a nice case. Another one that I really love, this one is near and dear to my heart, I've written about this a little bit, is an effect discovered by Ladon Shams and colleagues a few years back. So this is a really nice effect, and so this one's much more fragile than the McGurk or the ventriloquist effect. And so what I want you to do, I want to see if we can get it going here. Like I said, this is a pretty fragile one, so I'm not sure it's going to work. I want you to focus, I want you to foveate right up there, right around that hyphen on the words, and keep your attention focused up there. And I'm going to play a few slides and see if we can get this to work. Okay, so just pay attention. maybe a little more volume on this. So what did you hear? And what did you see? Okay, so let me play the next slide, see what we get. So again, I want you to focus up there. Keep foveated up there and pay attention. Okay, so what did you hear that time? And what did you see? 2 flashes? Okay, so a lot of 2 flashers. Okay, we're done. So the first example was just a single flash there and a single beep, and most people see the flash and hear the beep. The second one, though, was the same visual stimulus. Single flash, double beep, and most people get a nice, well, something like 80% are susceptible to this double flash. So you visually experience 2 flashes in response to that sound. Okay, so I like that because it's an effect where sound is really dominating vision. It's a really lovely effect. So these are a really nice class of effects. The first thing I think it's worth noting, especially in the context of Professor Eagleman's talk, is that these effects differ from synesthesia in various ways. I think the most salient ones are that they're totally common across the population, right? Everybody is susceptible to some degree, and they're also common within an individual across a lot of different domains, right? So I just showed you 5 different effects that I'm susceptible to all of them, although I'm not a synesthete. It's also the case that these effects are understandable as adaptive, unlike synesthesia, right? So the processes, this slide wasn't supposed to make it in there. Well, actually, this one is I'll leave this here. The processes that are responsible for these things involve a kind of principled form of conflict resolution, right? So when the information from different sensory systems, like visual and auditory, conflicts, what goes on is that you get a weighting or a resolution that goes in favor of the modality that's more reliable for that feature, right? So, for example, vision tends to win out on spatial matters, and audition tends to win out on temporal matters as a sort of rough start. So notice that conceptually, though, this notion of conflict resolution requires that there's a common subject matter. Right? So if we can't have a genuine conflict unless we're talking about the same thing, and even even an apparent conflict requires that the appearance of a common subject matter. So this subpersonal perceptual systems in these cases are treating the information from the different senses as stemming from a common source out there in the world. Right? So these crossmodal illusions demonstrate that perceptual systems are tracking features that are accessible to multiple sense modalities. So for example, objects that have shapes and make sounds, or spatial and temporal properties of events. Now, the interesting thing for our purposes is that these features include aesthetically relevant ones, like movement and rhythm, for example. Right? So for instance, you might both see and hear 2 objects collide, or see and hear the cackling of a villain in the theater. Or, for example, you might see and hear the location of a sound source in a musical performance, or see, hear, and even feel a rhythm, or some vocalizing. So, if that's right, then there are aesthetically relevant features that are accessible to multiple sense modalities. The critical thing for the overall argument, though, is that a single feature is both visually and auditorily experienced, for example, to be aesthetically relevant. So, in other words, the identity of that visible and audible feature itself has aesthetic significance. So notice we can't get that argument about the previous one where it's higher level cognition is explaining this away. So failing to perceive that identity of that feature would be failing to fully appreciate what's going on aesthetically with the work. So these cross-modal experiences matter aesthetically, and they're not just co-occurrences of a visual experience and an auditory experience. They're not just minimally multimodal. Okay, so on to the next form. You'll notice that every crucial step in the reasoning that I just went through about these cross-modal illusions had to do with subpersonal perceptual processes. But I drew a conclusion about experiences. So I relied on this implicit assumption that what's going on subpersonally rises to the level of conscious awareness, okay? But we can't take that for granted, okay? So we need further arguments to demonstrate that the results of this subpersonal recalibration are consciously available to us. Okay, so rather than just our performance on these tasks. Okay, so I think we can demonstrate through some phenomenological considerations that the results of this cross-modal recalibration are in fact experientially evident. Okay, so consider the difference between the following kinds of cases, right? So imagine seeing something yellow and feeling something fuzzy, right? So you're seeing something yellow and you're feeling something fuzzy. Now, it might be two separate things, but it might be the same thing. In this case, though, you don't realize it's the very same thing. So you see the tennis ball and you feel something fuzzy, but you don't realize it's the very same thing. Okay, so they're distinct experiences. On the other hand, you might make that identification, right? You might identify the thing seen with the thing felt, right? So the difference between seeing something yellow and feeling something fuzzy and perceptually experiencing the very same thing that's seen to be yellow as seeing fuzzy can be captured in terms of the conditions under which those experiences are accurate or veridical or non-illusory. So a perceptual experience of the first type, type A, sorry, this is for those of you who do logic, I'll say it in English. It says something is both something is F and something is G. That second type of experience has the content that something is both F and G. So it's got to be the same thing if this is to be true, whereas that doesn't require that it's the same thing. It might be different things. So the ducky and the teddy bear make that true, but not that true. That's all we need to know. Now, these two different kinds of experiences differ in what it's like subjectively to have them, right? So in the second kind of case, the bottom, the B-type cases, but not in the first type cases, you perceptually experience the thing that has the visible features to be the very same thing that has the audible features. Right? So it's a case where the cross-modal identity is experientially evident or apparent to you in the second case, but not the first. Okay, so it's worth noting these kinds of contrasts, right? They're not limited to sort of weird philosopher's thought experiments or something you might find in an Oliver Sacks story or something that most of you could rig up in your labs with headphones and goggles and all of that stuff. So we have lots of experiences of each of these kinds out in the real world, both illusory and veridical, with art and with non-art. So for example, imagine watching a movie with sound. That's a case where you have an experience of type B if things are going well. You hear and see the source as common. But think about what happens when the movie is really poorly dubbed, like it's a foreign film with poor dubbing. Or think about what happens when the soundtrack is offset just a little bit, right? Just enough you get past that threshold where it's almost impossible to watch, right? That's what's going on is a case where you go from having a B-type experience to having an A-type experience. So the appearance or the perceptual experience of cross-modal identification breaks down in those cases. The important thing to note for our purposes here is that these B-type experiences are ones that are irreducibly multimodal. That something is both yellow and fuzzy can't just be the upshot of a combination of two phenomenal experiences, each of which is proprietary to its own modality, the visual and the auditory, right? It's not enough to talk about the sum of those two things in order to explain what's going on, right? If we did so, we would fail to capture the perceptually apparent identity of that feature. And that identity isn't something you can get with a blindfold on or your ears covered, or even with your eyes open and your ears open, but not making the identification of those things, the putting together of that information. So it turns out that there's an aesthetically relevant feature, the identity or the unity of what's seen and what's heard, that isn't perceptible through experiences that are associated with any single modality, and they're not accessible through these experiences associated with different sense modalities that could occur entirely on their own and separately. Okay, so what we've got here, we've got this common feature, but then there's a kind of common experience of them, and it's a sort of novel sort of experience that matters aesthetically, right? And so that experience isn't just minimally multimodal. It's a novel variety of cross-modal perceptual awareness. Okay, so one worry about this kind of case that somebody might have that'll lead to the next case I want to talk about is that what I've been talking about is a distinctive sort of perceptual experience, right? Something going on in us, but it doesn't necessarily involve a distinct feature out in the world, right? So it's the same old feature, it's just something unique about the experience I'm having of it. So why think that that's some kind of distinctive sort of perceptible feature that might count as an aesthetically relevant property of the work itself? So I should say I'm not very moved by this objection, but some people really are. But I've got a response to it. So it turns out that there are a class of completely novel features that are accessible only by way of cross-modal perceptual experiences, right? So these are novel features that can't be accessed through experiences associated with any single sense modality that could occur on its own. So I'll call these things, I'm sort of calling them now emergent multimodal features. It's not a perfect term, but it goes some of the distance. But they're entirely new varieties of features that are accessible only through these cross-modal experiences. So one example of this, I think a kind of a nice example, is the case of flavor. And I'm not just talking about taste like bitterness or sweetness. I'm talking about flavor. Flavor perception, to a pretty large extent, requires the operation of both taste as well as orthonasal, which is the front of your nose, and retronasal, those little holes in the back of your palate, olfaction. Okay, so it turns out that there are a number of flavors that you just could not experience perceptually if you didn't have both taste and smell functioning properly. Right? So these are actually novel, perceptible features that you just can't get at with one or the other sense modality on its own. Another class of features that I think provide a nice example of this are actually have to do with these audio-visual source cases, or audio-visual causation. So the idea is you see, right? So you see that thing, that event, and you hear the sound, but you perceptually experience that visible event to cause the sound, right? To be the source of that sound. So you see the event, you hear the sound, but there's this new kind of emergent feature that is that the visual event is responsible for the thing that you hear. And that's not something that you can get with vision working on its own or audition working on its own. And that's causality in the world that you're responding to that's multimodally accessible. Okay, so this flavors and this intermodal causation, and I think actually speech provides a number of nice examples of this kind of thing. But they provide examples of features that are perceptible by means of the senses. They're aesthetically relevant things, at least potentially. They're not accessible through perceptual experiences that are associated with any single modality working on its own. And they're accessible only through experiences that involve more than one sense working in concert. Okay, so the schematic here looks like this novel feature that you're aware of only thanks to those experiences happening together. All right, so that's 5 forms. There's just one more. The last form that I want to talk about is something that I've been calling parasitic crossmodal transfer. So this occurs when some feature is perceptible through experiences that are associated with one sense modality, say hearing, for example, but only in a way that depends upon some other sense modality, like vision. Okay, so we have the parasitic experiences in one sense, and then we've got the hosts in another. So these features are, or this effect is something like a variety of veridical and totally, it happens a lot, synesthesia. So it's kind of veridical synesthesia. Okay, so what are some examples of this kind of thing? Some examples include, surprisingly, some spatial features. So the philosopher George Berkeley, a long time ago, is notorious for arguing that you couldn't see spatial features if you couldn't touch spatial features, right? If you didn't have kinesthetic and bodily and tactual awareness of space, you wouldn't have visual awareness of that nice three-dimensional space that you see. Other philosophers more recently, and actually scientists, have argued that the auditory experience of certain spatial features is parasitic on visual experience. So, and I think actually it is plausible that there are at least some spatial features that you really can hear. You actually hear them, in the full sense of that term, but that you couldn't hear unless you could also see and tactually, kinesthetically engage with them. Okay, so that's a case in which the auditory experience of that spatial feature is parasitic on visual experiences, right? So you've got this kind of connection there, and then ultimately you get awareness in the other sense modality of that feature. Another example of this that I think is a demonstration of the same kind of thing is much more common, and I think, it's almost, it's empirically demonstrable, and it's introspectable as well. And this is the case of seeing like a sculpture or a painting or even just a material object to be a solid object, right? To be something that would resist deformation or penetration. And that's something that we get visual cues of and visually experience that you might think requires tactual forms of awareness. Okay, so those are just a couple of examples, and there are others. But these features, notice that the things I've talked about so far, spatial features and things like solidity and density, are all potentially aesthetically relevant features. So, for example, you could see the textural character of a painting, right? And that impacts the aesthetic experience of the work. So these are a class of cross-modally parasitic experiences that matter aesthetically. Okay? Notice that each of them requires and depends on either prior or even simultaneous in some instances, perceptual awareness that happens through another sense modality, the host, right? So the parasite depends on and requires the host experiences. So these experiences, the auditory experience of spatial features, for example, depends on multimodal awareness in a way that makes these things more than just minimally multimodal. Okay, so that's 6 forms of multimodal awareness. So we started off with something that looked like this, right? And by the end, we've got to something that looks like this. And you might be asking yourself at this point, what does this mean for this whole idea of unimodal arts that I mentioned at the outset? And I think the prospects are dim, in fact. So let's start with strong unimodality. Right? Remember, I distinguished these strong and weak forms. So I'll put that slide. Yeah, there we go. So put that slide back up. So from the definition of a strongly unimodal art form, remember, only perceptual experiences that are associated with some single sense modality matter aesthetically. So there aren't any features that are aesthetically relevant that are accessible to some other sense modality. So here's a claim. There is no extant art form that is strongly unimodal. And I think the argument for this is relatively straightforward. So in general, perceptual experiences that are associated with some particular sense modality include not just awareness of what we might call proper sensibles of that modality. So features like color in vision, which are accessible only to vision. You know, you can't hear color, barring synesthetic effects. Or pitch in audition, right? So pitch is something that you can hear but not perceived by any other sense. So these are proper sensibles. They can only be accessed by one sense modality, right? So they look like this. So even if we're here, this is a proper sensible. On the other hand, this is a common sensible. That's a feature that can be accessed by multiple sense modalities. And these features include spatial features, things like shape and distance and the like, as well as features like motion and generally spatial and temporal characteristics fit into the category of common sensibles. Okay, so what I was saying was that in general, perceptual experiences involves, perceiving not just proper sensibles, but also common sensibles. So, I see the color of this, but also perceive visually the shape of it. And that shape is something that I could also touch. So the thought here is that what goes for perceiving in general goes for perceiving artworks. In particular, it's true for each of the candidate or apparently unimodal art forms that I mentioned at the start, including visual arts and music and sound art. So, for example, take painting. When you look at a painting, you see the colors, for example, but you also see things like size and shape and texture. In the case of music, you hear a bunch of sounds, and you hear their pitches and their timbres and their loudness, but you also hear things like where they come from and how long they last and tempo and features like whether a large or a small or a wooden or a brass instrument made it, and things like if its source is a collision or a sustained vibration. And those are all features that are accessible by means of other sense modalities. So plausibly, for any art form, common sensibles, in addition to proper sensibles, are aesthetically relevant. They make and can make an aesthetic difference. So, for any art form, perceptual experiences associated with more than one sense modality matter aesthetically. So that means there isn't any good candidate for a strongly unimodal art form. They're all at least weakly unimodal in light of these common sensibles. So nothing fits into that category. Okay, so that's the quick argument against strong unimodality. What about the weaker form? Certainly that's got to be true. Well, from the definition of what it is to be a weak unimodal art form, okay, so now we're on to weak unimodality. Remember the idea here was that there's one sense modality that suffices to get at all of those aesthetically relevant features. Even though you can have common sensibles, there's one sense modality that allows you to reach all of the essential aesthetically relevant features of the work. Okay, so we can have common sensibles that just need one modality that gives you access to all of them. So here's the claim. There aren't any art forms that necessarily are weak unimodal art forms. That is, no art form is such that perceptual experiences that are associated with any given sense modality suffice to reveal all of the aesthetically relevant perceptible features of that work, or instances of that work. So why is that? Well, take any instance of a candidate weak unimodal art form. So, for example, a performance of a piece of music, or a sound art installation, or a painting maybe, or possibly a photograph. So, for each of these things, it's possible to perceive it through experiences that are associated with different sense modalities. You can see and hear the performance of the music or the sound art. You can see and you can touch the painting or the print. you can see and hear architectural features of, spatial features of architecture, and maybe even feel it. So whenever you can perceive an instance of such a thing through more than one sense modality, it's possible to have these cross-modal perceptual experiences I mentioned earlier, which aren't just minimally multimodal. So think of the last few forms that I went through. You could have multimodal perceptual awareness in which cross-modal feature binding or identification or integration or unity is experientially evident or apparent to you, where you identify the thing across the senses. So for example, you could see and feel a painting, or maybe the texture of a painting. You could see and hear the source of a sound, or its location, or its duration. But that identity isn't something that you could perceive with a single modality. Dealing with emergent multimodal features, you could have one of these cross-modal perceptual experiences that gets at these emergent features that couldn't be accessed by other means. So, for example, flavor in the case of food, or visual acoustical causation. Or you could have parasitic cross-modal transfer and the experiences that result from that. So you could see the solidity or the texture of a painting or of a print, or you could hear, for example, the voluminousness of a sound, or maybe even detailed spatial features you couldn't otherwise access. So each of these things describe cases of cross-modal perceptual experiences, of instances of artworks, and none of them is minimally multimodal in the sense I talked about before. They actually reveal aesthetically relevant features, even of these apparently unimodal artworks, and they reveal features that can't be accessed through any single sense modality operating entirely on its own. So it turns out that there's no single sense modality that could suffice to access all of the possible aesthetically relevant perceptible features of those works. So, if that's right, then these works don't even belong to weakly unimodal art forms. Right? In fact, though not necessarily by design, they're all strongly multimodal art forms. More than one sense is required to access all of their aesthetically relevant perceptible features. Okay, so that's the argument. I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about some concluding thoughts in response to this. So I started off talking about these two questions, and in response to the first question about multimodal art, what I said was that there's a variety of these richly multimodal perceptual phenomena that are relevant to assessing the aesthetic properties of works of art. And in fact, perceptually engaging with these aesthetically relevant features requires forms of cross-modal perceptual experience that can't exhaustively be characterized in terms of experiences that are associated with different sense modalities that in principle could have occurred independently or in absence of each other. And so they require having those multiple senses working in concert. In response to the second question, by arguing against even the weak unimodal art forms, what I did was present in outline, admittedly, the basis of a case for skepticism about any distinction in kind between unimodal and multimodal art forms. Okay, so on a final set of notes, I think thinking about what the lessons of this are, first of all, the study of these kind of multimodal perceptual effects, I think, reveals a potentially huge variety of features of artworks, including musical works and performances, that affect their aesthetic characteristics. And secondly, while the role of these kinds of features up until recently, I think, has remained mainly intuitive or subconscious, this really opens up the door to potentially manipulating these kinds of features to aesthetic to aesthetic effect, right, and artistic effect, beyond just the usual ones of the sound visual cases. And finally, this is a place where understanding the relevant underlying cognitive science and neuroscience is going to, I think, play a pretty pivotal role in shaping the development of the arts. So thank you. I think there was a few minutes for a couple of questions.
Yes, I was wondering if you considered the kind of modalities that artists talk about when they are talking about visual pieces of art, such as lines and so forth. Because I believe that it's really true that there's unexplored cognitive science and philosophy that have sides of aesthetic dimensions that aren't normally thought of. Because a painting is static, and yet definitely something in our internal mental cortex is being stimulated when we get a sense of motion from. And people have studied things like, even like printing and calligraphy. So John McCarthy at Stanford talked about how in thought cases, the order which, not necessarily the order which you make the stroke, but the action of making the strokes is somehow evoked too, when you're aesthetically considering the typefaces that you're looking at.
Yeah, so that raises a lot of issues. I think that last thing is a form of parasitic transfer, sort of in another direction. You're kind of activating the experience. I didn't really talk about that direction, but that's a nice example. I mean, I think in response to some of this, there's clearly some varieties of effect that look like the sort of transfer I was talking about. I think the broader lesson that I take from this is that I think conceptually still, the cognitive and neurosciences are really stuck in this model of low-level sensations, right? We've got low-level sensations, and then we just slap them together, right? And the perceiving an object is just perceiving, whiteness and shape, and the rest of those, whatever those basic features are. The idea that there are basic features. But this seems to me to be just an absurd view for lots of reasons, theoretical and empirical reasons. It looks like there's stuff going on subpersonally that's responsive to those kinds of features, but then that there's further computation and interaction and building that goes on entirely at a subpersonal level. So by the time we get to anything that's the personal level, you've got these kind of rich things that can't be decomposed into anything that looks like a sensory unit. Okay, so things like movement and dynamism might be examples of these features that emerge at a relatively high level that have been ignored because they don't sort of, responsiveness to them doesn't begin in receptor surfaces, for example. Okay, so I think, again, we're stuck in this kind of sensory atomism conceptually, and I think moving beyond that will open up the door to investigating these sorts of features.
Well, I was just looking at the research on conceptual blending, because that's what that is all about. Like, kind of sensory information.
There's a question.
I have two questions. My first question is, do you think that this crossmodality or multimodality might be an intrinsic feature or an intrinsic part of how art can be understood? And the second one is, I would just be interested to know a little bit more about the third of the comment point, is how you, just kind of tease you, how do you imagine that cognitive science could somehow contribute to the role of art form in the
Well, look, I think can everybody hear me okay here? Or do I need a Okay. I think the kinds of things that are going on at this conference are crucial, right? To exploit the scientific research artistically requires knowing about it. And to have research that's specifically geared to impacting the arts requires that scientists know about what artists care about and pay attention to it. So I think these kinds of projects are the sort of thing that will drive that. and some of this bridging work. I don't have specific hypotheses about what will happen. I'm no artist, as you can tell from my slide. That's about as sophisticated as I get. Certainly what we're discovering is really this stuff on multimodality and crossmodality has emerged as a sort of focused category of research just in the last decade or so. It's come into view pretty recently. So I think as the various effects get discovered, enterprising artists, as really, and on the slide I said continue to, since we have really robust examples of the latest scientific views affecting the development of art, going back, I'm sure the historian will have supplementation to this, but the stuff I know about is, the late 19th century. Tons of painting in the late 19th century was driven by the going views in conceptual psychology. Sorry, I'm sort of being front-centric. One more here. Yeah, and then,
To go back to your example of our whole being one of the sum of its parts, you use the example of scenes being off in the movie. But it seems to me that there's examples where like that, where there's actually aesthetic issues. So, for example, you're watching dance, and you hear the music, you see the dancers. If the dancers are off the beat,
yeah.
that's either poor or it's a point. But there's an aesthetic issue that has to do with the integration between the two.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so that's a perfect example of this kind of thing. Yeah, right? I mean, it's, in watching a movie when the timing is off, it's just terrible. And clever directors can manipulate this and do it right intentionally. You think it's an accident, but really understanding the work requires realizing that this effect is there and it's there on purpose.
What about someone who's deaf or blind? Like, how would
Yeah.
that fit into the unimodal?
Yeah. So I've been getting into a lot of trouble for saying this, but I've now got a good response. So I think someone who is deaf or blind, in some respects, is having an impoverished perceptual experience. There are features of works that they're unable to access. And I say this because I believe it's true. But it also turns out, if you think about this, you realize it's impoverished relative to what we're accessing, but we're also impoverished relative to the person who's deaf, for example. So the deaf person who has super fine-grained spatial hearing. So I don't know how many of you know about this kid with the bicycle. So this is I'm speaking of a blind. There was a blind child who was able to ride a bicycle down the street by basically echoing, by making clicking sounds and hearing where he was. Right, okay, so he can play basketball. I don't know too many of the details of the case, but this is an astounding kind of effect. Surely that individual is having an enriched auditory perceptual experience relative to me. And so that opens up the possibility. So I was speaking, there's a theater director in London who's working with blind individuals to enhance their experience of the theater. And so what they're doing is exploring the various kinds of possibilities for these aesthetic aspects that maybe someone who's sighted would be unable to access at all, to enhance that. So the idea is there are differences, surely, in some respects impoverished, but we're also impoverished relative to such individuals. One more.
I'm curious if you would consider, or which modality you would consider to be parasitic in opera.
To be parasitic, that's a good question. What I would do is talk about specific effects rather than some modality in particular that's being parasitic. So it's perfectly reasonable to think that in some ways the auditory sense is parasitic on the visual in appreciating an opera. But I think it's also reasonable to think that vision might be parasitic on tactual and proprioceptive awareness as well. So again, what I would want to do is focus on specific effects rather than talking about the overarching story. Okay, thanks very much.